Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today, in the first ever episode of MFA Writers, I'm excited to be talking to Mary Henn, a third-year MFA candidate from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Mary is a poet, she's an essayist, and she is the most recent winner of AWP's Intro Journals Award for her essay Assemblies, which will soon be appearing in Hayden's Ferry review. Mary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll get to the award and the MFA program in a bit, but it would feel strange not to mention that it's been a pretty eventful couple of weeks in America. We're recording this interview on June 8th, and I know you attended the Black Lives Matter protest at City Hall this past weekend with a few of your fellow MFA students. So I was curious whether you consider your writing to be political, and if you think writing in general has a role to play in protest and in politics.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if I consider my own writing overly political. Necessarily. I write a lot about gender issues, a lot about trauma. I don't myself write about, racism, specifically as a white woman. But I think it's important, especially in the times that we're in, to highlight different voices, different issues, different narratives, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, I think writing is inherently political. I mean, it's impossible not to have a political aspect to it, but the really good writing, I think, is subversively political. Like, those things kind of happen naturally. Like, they show up. Like, I've read a lot of your work, and you mentioned trauma. There's a lot of your pieces are about addiction, and I definitely consider it to be to have political aspects in it. Sure. I can't help when reading it to think that there's some commentary happening under the surface about how we treat people, on the margins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of political issues are intersectional, right? So, writing about addiction, for instance, is also writing about socioeconomics and trauma, and sometimes gender. So there's a lot of overlap, I think, in those themes and those issues. You
talk about gender and addiction, and also family comes up a lot in your work. So, where do you think those themes come from for you? Like, why are those the things that draw you in the most, or inspire you the most?
I think that's what I know. And I've noticed too, that a lot of writers, their first book or first collection of poems or essays or whatever it is, often write about family. That seems to be a starting place for a lot of writers. As far as the other themes go, I think that's what I grew up around. That was my experience for the majority of my life. So it's natural to write about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, most of the debut collections that I read, even works of fiction, you have this sense when you're reading it that this is an experience, at least partially an experience that the author went through. And that's why it's, I don't want to say easier, but maybe necessary in those first pieces.
Yeah, to get it out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but I consider writing as a form of therapy in a way. It's partially about creating a product that people might, that hopefully want to read, but it's also a way to kind of work through things that I'm dealing with.
I find that too. I think writing helps to make art out of something that's happened, some experience that's happened that maybe wouldn't be considered useful or productive or beautiful otherwise.
So do you remember the first time that you wrote a story or a poem? Is there a moment from when you were younger when you maybe realized the power in writing a story or writing a poem?
I don't remember the moment, like a specific moment in which I sat down and wrote something and appreciated, the power of writing or the act of writing like I do now. But I do remember reading and moments, growing up, or even as a young adult, like specific moments where I read something that changed the way I thought about language and writing and communication.
Well, so you studied creative writing as an undergrad, right?
Yeah.
So do you remember when you decided to go that route?
Yes, I do. So I had no idea what I was doing as an undergraduate student. Didn't really have a lot of guidance. And I was in a speech class, a freshman speech class with Dr. Nora Cox at Missouri State University. And she was she is a great teacher. But she played Nikki Finney's acceptance speech for the National Book Award. Nikki Finney won the National Book Award for her collection of poems, Had Often Split, in 2011. And we watched that speech in class, and that was huge for me. I think that was the first very clear moment where I wanted to do something like that, to be able to communicate like that and write like that.
How old were you at that time?
I was a freshman in college, so I had just turned 18. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, were you already majoring in creative writing, or were you still trying to figure it out?
I wasn't majoring. I was undeclared. I didn't have a major. But after that speech class, I enrolled in a poetry class, and that's sort of when I started writing.
You went straight from Missouri State then into the MFA program at UMKC. What was it that made you want to pursue an MFA degree?
Yeah, so I did my bachelor's degree at Missouri State in creative writing. And after graduation, they offered a graduate teaching assistantship to me at Missouri State. So I did an MA there for 2 years. And after that, I didn't really have any set plans. So one of my professors at the time had encouraged me to apply to MFA programs. So that's what I did.
And was there a specific reason you chose UMKC, or did it have to do with being close to where you grew up?
Yeah, so the first MFA program that I was accepted into with funding was Northern Michigan University. And so I had planned, after I received that call, my plan was to pack up and move to Michigan. And then I had spoken to someone who was in the MFA program at Northern Michigan at that time. And after talking with her, I decided that maybe that program wasn't the best fit for me. And then a little bit later, I did receive an offer from UMKC. I had applied to UMKC because I grew up in Kansas City. And I decided at that time it would be the best move for me, financially, to move back to Kansas City because I had, somewhat of a support system here. So I moved back to Kansas City, started the MFA program, and I'm really glad that things worked out that way because it turned out that 2019 was a pretty hectic year for my family. So it was I was grateful to be back in the city.
So you talked about the financial part a little bit. UMKC's MFA program is a 3-year partially funded program, which means some students receive assistantships and fellowships that cover tuition and provide a stipend while other students have to pay for the program. You're funded as a teaching assistant. Was that a big factor in your decision?
Absolutely. I did not have the means to attend an MFA program that wasn't fully funded.
Mm-hmm.
I realize that UMKC technically is partially funded, but as you said, with the assistantship, it is, fully
Yeah,
funded.
it's right. You get the funding. So, how has teaching been? Have you found it difficult to balance the teaching with the writing?
Teaching has been a good experience for me overall. I think that, and I did teach, so I taught 2 years at Missouri State during the MA, and I've been teaching at UMKC now it's been just about 2 years here as well. I don't know. At the risk of sounding like totally cheesy, I feel like I've learned just as much from my students, probably more from my students than they've learned from me. It's you teach, so I feel like having to lecture and stand in front of a group of people, adults, is nerve-wracking, and I think eventually it sort of builds your confidence once you get used to it. So I feel like I think I communicate better. I think I interact with others better. Yeah, I like teaching, but it does distract from writing sometimes.
And UMKC being like an urban university, the student body is really diverse and really interesting. Like, what's your experience been with like the students, the undergrads?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that, because the intro level discourse classes that we teach as GTAs are often very diverse, and it's been shown through data that those classes, because there are 3 levels, right? 100, 200, 300. As you move up toward 300, those classrooms become statistically less diverse.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, right? And there are a lot of things I think you could say about that. But I do love teaching 100 and even 200 because, you have different voices, different perspectives, people from different parts of the world. Yeah.
I think in general, like if for anyone who's attending an MFA program, if they're going to have a teaching assistantship, they're probably going to be teaching like an intro level composition course, which is essentially what discourse is at UMKC.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for me, there's so many interesting stories, like so many interesting experiences that these young people are bringing to the classroom that I really enjoy teaching as well. Outside of, being close to home, what has your experience been like in the program? I know you started off in poetry and you've started writing a bit more nonfiction these days. What influenced that decision, and like what has that experience been like for you?
So I took my first nonfiction class ever. I hadn't taken any workshops outside of the genre of poetry before. At Missouri State, I had only studied poetry. So I took nonfiction with Dr. Christy Hodgen in the fall of 2019. And I was really nervous going into it because I didn't think that I could do it. I remember talking to friends who, in the program, who are nonfiction writers, and just being like, I can't do this. It's going to be a mess. But
you were writing like prose poetry anyway, right? So I guess there's some crossover there.
Yeah, I think, and that's the thing that I realized, is that most of my poetry maybe isn't actually poetry. It's all nonfiction. All of my poetry is nonfiction. There are just line breaks and it's condensed. And so I found that writing nonfiction was actually more of like an enjoyable process for me, because I had room to take up a page and tell the whole story. there aren't any real differences between what I write for poetry and what I write for nonfiction. I think
Subject-wise?
Yeah, subject-wise and also stylistically. I think that, as you mentioned, so many of my poems are prose poems that are derivative of my own experiences, and my nonfiction tends to be lyrical. So, and, if you start to compare like a prose poem to a lyric essay, they're sort of indistinguishable by definition, by their definitions or lack of. So yeah, for me, it's all the same. The way that I label it is different. And the fact that I feel like I have more space, more room to write in nonfiction.
Right. Well, UMKC's program is somewhat unique in that they have classes in fiction, nonfiction, poetry, screenwriting, and playwriting. And it actually has an interdisciplinary component to it. So you're encouraged to take those classes outside of your emphasis. Do you think you would have taken a nonfiction course if you'd have been in a different program, or would you just stuck with poetry?
I don't think that I would have. I didn't take a nonfiction class at Missouri State, and that was an option. Those were available to me. I wish I would have now. No, I saw it as a requirement, and I needed to take a workshop in a genre outside of poetry, and so I did that. But I think that actually my nonfiction is a lot better than my poetry for whatever reason. So I'm glad that I did it.
I've read both, and they're both really good. So maybe you're being a little hard on yourself. But so let's talk about this award. It was recently announced that you are one of the 2020 winners of AWP's Intro Journals Award for your essay Assemblies, which will soon be published in Hayden's Ferry Review. Did you write this essay in that nonfiction class with Dr. Hodgen?
I did. So that essay, Assemblies, started as a flash nonfiction piece. So like the first chunk of text was a response to Joanne Beard's The Boys of My Youth. I did not intend for it to be any longer than 500 words. Then later in the workshop, we were required to write a longer essay, and I used that first section that I had written previously as a starting point and went from there.
So the essay itself focuses on your time growing up in Catholic school and hits on that theme of gender that you had talked about earlier in the podcast. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind actually reading that first section of the piece, the part that originally was a flash piece.
Yeah, I can. So this is the first section from Assemblies. We hold out through the morning hours for recess. In 6th grade, our Catholic school uniforms are rolled skirts, knee-high socks, and spiky multicolored earrings to give us an edge. I have one less roll than the other girls, and stockier legs. The earrings do not give me an edge. When we reach the door, we head for the hill, and the wind folds my skirt upward. I press the khaki pleats to my thighs as the other girls yell out that they don't want to see my underwear. They laugh. My teacher calls me back after I'm halfway up the hill. You aren't wearing shorts under your skirt? I thought you were one of the good girls, she says, her face bent in disappointment. I apologize, and she tells me to remember shorts tomorrow. I race to the top of the hill where there sits a miniature wooden boat, a playful emblem of Noah's Ark. It is a boat because of its shape, a steering wheel and a flag, all made of wood. The flag is not real, and it does not move in the wind. The boat has 2 stories. There is an upper deck and a crawl space that only allows the children in its belly to sit upright, never to stand up. We pack 5 of us in this space, leaving room for 1 boy. We talk of things we know nothing about. We don't make believe that we are on a ship in the middle of an ocean. There is no captain here. We know that we are in a small box of wood on top of a grassy hill in Missouri. We find a condom. Only one of us knows what this is, and it's not the boy. At 11, I know more about intimacy than I do about sex. What I know about sex is kissing and romance and holding hands. There's speculation about who has forgotten this artifact, who has left it behind. We take turns touching it until the whistle blows. And I wonder who would do that here, because I wonder how a box can be romantic. Down the hill, there's a new stillness in the teacher's voice. I slide into my desk with my knees pressed together. I don't want anyone to see.
All right, thanks for reading. That was great. And I have to say, you said earlier that you don't consider your writing political, but I can't help but, hear that, and also in my head hear a commentary on how we treat women and young girls and how we train them to think about their own bodies.
And this piece specifically deals with, as you mentioned, of course, gender, sex, religion, abuse in different forms. So, yeah, and I don't normally write about religion in this way either. But yeah, I think that this piece maybe is political in those ways.
Yeah, but not overtly. It's not like in your face. It's not like we're reading a story that says, a manual on how to talk to women. It's just illuminating this experience, showing it to people so that they can come to those conclusions on their own, which is what I mean when I say subversive. And I do think that your writing is like subversively political. Like later in the same piece, there was a line that stood out to me. There's a guest speaker who comes to the school and his talking about sex education, but you say she's not demonstrating how to roll a condom onto a banana. Instead, she is here to say no man wants to be with a girl who has given her gift away, because once a girl has lost her virginity, she has lost value. Mm-hmm. Which for me, that's like in a lot of ways, that's a political statement about how we talk about sex in this country and the damage that silence can have on young people who are trying to figure it out on their own.
Right. And especially, having attended Catholic school, sex education wasn't a thing. Teaching abstinence was their sort of method for dealing with teenagers, I think. But I think that speaks to, larger issues of, not only how we treat women generally, but how religion, Catholicism, Christianity has, embedded certain often harmful beliefs within
it's seeped into public policy, right? I was raised Catholic as well, and I didn't go to Catholic school, but even in the public school, I don't remember having extensive sex education in which people just talked about it, right? It was always talked around, and especially in those Catholic settings, it wasn't talked about at all. It was just something you don't do. And so then you internalize shame, which I think is one thing that you're exploring in this essay, which is really good. And I'm super excited for it to be published in Hayden's Ferry Review. And am I right that this is the first thing that you've ever submitted? Did I hear that?
It is the first piece of nonfiction that I've ever submitted. And I actually, if it were up to me, I wouldn't have submitted it at all.
Why?
Seriously though, so during the workshop with Dr. Hodgen, we had to write 2 large essays. So I wrote one about my brother. And then the second essay that I wrote for that class was Assemblies. And I wouldn't say that the process was rushed for me, but I did write it with a little bit of pressure time-wise, which maybe, was a good thing after all. But I submitted it to the workshop. People had sort of mixed feelings about it. I did not like it.
So I think there's probably a lesson here for anyone who is intimidated about submitting their work, or maybe self-conscious about it, because it's a great essay. And Dr. Hodgen submitted it for you, or she suggested you submit it. How did the AWP Intro Journal Prize work exactly?
Right. So I received an email notifying me that I had been nominated for the AWP Intro Journals Award in nonfiction. And I was surprised because I'm still not like on the nonfiction track. So I thought it was a mistake initially. And so I went to Dr. Hodgen and I said, hey, I got this weird email telling me to submit a piece of nonfiction for an AWP prize. And I was like, was that a mistake? And she said, no, it's not a mistake. I think your writing is good. I would like you to submit she wanted me, I think, to submit the first essay that I wrote for her class, which is a better essay. But I have a lot of stake in that essay and it wasn't ready to go out yet. I think this one was a little bit closer. So I took Assemblies when I submitted to the workshop was over 3,000 words. I cut out major parts of it. Now it's about 2,300 words, and submitted it thinking that, really like knowing that it wasn't going to get any recognition. And then it did, and I was very shocked.
Well, so, we have two examples here. One is being in the MFA program, taking a class, you had this deadline in which you had to produce an essay for class, right?
Right.
Which turned out to be this essay, and then which you didn't think was good, but that your professor encouraged you to submit, and that ended up winning a pretty big prize and is going to be published now. So do you think the MFA program has helped you to progress as a writer, just kind of enforcing you to produce and to submit where maybe you wouldn't have otherwise?
In this way, with Assemblies, yes. In other ways, not so much.
So can that also be a negative, I guess? Like we talked earlier about how writing can be, obviously is producing a product that you hope gets published, but it's also can be a form of self-exploration. Do you ever find that you lose some of that kind of self-exploration or therapy that you would normally get from writing because you're forced to produce a product for class?
That's a tough question. I think maybe with this piece, there was a little bit of luck involved. I started writing it in November of 2019, submitted it either that month or in December, and then was told that it had won the award and was being published in March, which is seems to me like a pretty, fast process start to finish. And I will say that I have been writing poems for many years now. And I don't submit work for publication very often, but I have submitted poetry before and have not had success. So this wasn't like the first thing I'd ever written and sent out and it was published.
Right.
But I think with this piece, I was forced, because the process was so fast, I was forced to so I wrote the essay, it went through workshop, and then I decided to edit it for submission to the prize. And knowing that I had to have it submitted by a certain date, I cut big chunks of it, which I normally wouldn't do. I think I would cling to those, and like a poem or like a different essay, I would be afraid to make huge cuts and huge edits like that. But because of time, anything that like stood out as just like not fitting in the piece, I tried to just cut completely.
In my experience in the MFA program, one of the biggest things I've learned, I'm just finishing up my first year, but one of the biggest things I learned this year was revision and being able to recognize the parts that, even though you really might like a paragraph and you really want to cling to it, it might not belong in that particular story, and learning where to take those things out. So you're going into your third year in the MFA program, which means your thesis. Do you plan on doing like a mix of poetry and nonfiction for your thesis, or are you going to stick fully to nonfiction?
I don't know if I'm allowed to only write nonfiction. I'll have to check on that. But at the very least, I plan to write a thesis that is a hybrid of lyric essays, nonfiction, and poetry, prose poems specifically.
Are you excited? Nervous?
I don't know. I have mixed feelings about the thesis. It won't be the first creative thesis that I've written. I did a poetry thesis for my MA, which was not good. It was very rushed. I did not know what I was doing at all. I was avoiding writing about certain things. It was just kind of all over the place. And I think, going into a thesis this year, 3 years later, I think I want it to be more personal. I want it to be something that I'm proud of, something that I plan on hopefully sending out and, getting published maybe.
One thing that really amazes me and that I really respect about nonfiction writers is the ability to like put themselves out there. I mean, like me as a fiction writer, I can write about an experience I've had and, cloak it in the title of fiction. And, I have the option to hide behind that in a sense. But with nonfiction, you really have to put yourself out there. And I could see how even over the course of a few years, how like you could really change and really grow to the point of feeling comfortable doing that.
Yeah, and I'm definitely in a different place now than I was 3 years ago as a writer, as a person, as a sister, as a daughter. So, I also feel like so much has happened in 3 years that the content will look completely different.
Well, you mentioned that, the hope is that it gets published, and I hope that for you as well, because like I said, I've read a lot of your work, and I think it's all good, even the poetry. And so I look forward to reading your thesis. Good luck writing it. And thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.